Nicephorus I came to power in 802 as the usurper against the Empress Irene. He only reigned for 9 years and faced two would-be usurpers of his own in the course of that 9-year period. Yet, despite the brevity of his reign and the fact that he never fully established legitimacy, Nicephorus I is one of the most important Byzantine emperors of his era. So today I'd like to take a look at his life and times and talk about how a man can be both an important reformer and be transformed into a human skull cup in just 9 years. Let's look at Nicephorus's early life and his origins. Byzantine sources are silent on this point, but the Syriac source Michael the Syrian, along with two Arab sources, Al-Tabari and Masudi, all say that Nicephorus was the descendant of the Ghassanid dynasty. If you'll recall, the Ghassanid kingdom had been destroyed during the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628, and then the ruling house had retreated along with Byzantine forces as they withdrew from the Near East during the Arab invasions. And apparently this family had managed to retain its wealth and stature, and Nicephorus managed to rise to a position of prominence. At some point during his earlier life, Nicephorus seems to have acquired some military experience. It looks like he was relatively well respected by the military, and that would only make sense if he had some experience of his own. So it's possible that he served in the army in some capacity before he became a bureaucrat. In his later career, right before becoming emperor, he was elevated to the office of logothete. We'll talk about the specifics of that in a minute. But the fact that he got to that office implies that he had quite a bit of bureaucratic experience, and possibly more importantly, he must have had some connections to Irene, since she was relatively notorious for only promoting her own favorites. And it should come as no surprise to you that he was also a fairly reliable iconophile. Nicephorus's official office was Logothetes to Genaku, and this was the highest level of logothete, and it made him one of the most powerful bureaucrats in Byzantium. Now, the fact that he held this high office meant that he would have been in fairly regular contact with Irene and all of the other ministers of the government, so he was in a pretty good position to be privy to the conspiracy that eventually overthrew Irene, and it's probable that he could also use his position to gain and retain her trust and, make sure that suspicion didn't come his way. At any rate, his principal responsibility in that office was financial management, which, as you'll recall from our video on Irene, would have been extremely difficult since her policy was to give out massive tax breaks to the wealthy and to also pay off the Caliph of the Abbasids in order to buy peace. So between keeping expenditures high and cutting taxes massively, it would have been very difficult for a finance minister to keep things together, especially in an era when there was no such thing as deficit spending. So you can imagine that if the officials who overthrew Irene were disgruntled people who wanted to bring back good government, that Nicephorus would be able to complain the most loudly and the most justifiably. And his office of Logothetes to Genaku would remain one of the most powerful Byzantine offices until the time of the Komnenoi, when the offices of the state began to evolve and change even more, and this office sort of faded into obscurity. The actual title of Logothete eventually becomes more of an honorary thing without any actual functions, but that's still quite a way in the future. Anyway, we still don't really know exactly how Nicephorus, what his role was in the conspiracy against Irene, but we do know that ultimately he was selected to be the new emperor by the people who were responsible for overthrowing Irene, and that he would have assumed the throne in October of 802. When Nicephorus seized the throne in 802, he inherited a whole world of problems, some of which were mostly due to his two immediate predecessors, Irene and Constantine VI, and others of which were due to more long-term factors such as the Arab invasions. So, speaking of the Arabs, one of the major problems in Nicephorus's time is that Arab forces were able to threaten both Asia Minor and Sicily. Nicephorus was never really able to do much about that, as his focus would be directed elsewhere. He also had a staunch and capable enemy in the First Bulgarian Empire. This empire was now big enough to thwart any of his ambitions in the Balkans unless it was dealt with, so he would have to spend a lot of his time dealing with the Bulgars. To compound that, the Balkans were mostly lost and had been for a couple centuries, so this was an area where Nicephorus couldn't expect to draw much support, even though he had some ambitions in that area. Now, obviously, the first challenge that he would have faced is that his empire was more or less bankrupt after Irene's disastrous policies. It's also possible that after 5 years of reckless military policy and reckless financial policy, that the army was not quite what it could be. Now, 5 years is not a long time. The institution was probably still mostly sound, but we have to imagine that there was a little bit of slippage in terms of preparation and morale due to possible pay shortages or pay cuts that had to happen because of Irene's policies. The icon issue was not actually settled. Now, Irene had restored the icons back in 787, but there were still iconoclasts running around, in addition to people who didn't agree on how to keep the icons around. Some people, as we'll see, wanted to go and persecute the iconoclast. And on top of all of that, there's an ongoing legitimacy crisis. Now, Irene had never been accepted, and then when she's usurped, that's effectively usurping the Isaurian dynasty. So Nicephorus now has some enemies, and it turns out that Irene had at least a few supporters who still believed in her, and Nicephorus gets to inherit all of those as well. So, to put it lightly, he had his work cut out for him, and his was a reign that was marked by lots and lots of fighting. During his own reign, the Emperor Nicephorus managed to maintain peace within the church. However, after his death, some of his successors ran into problems due to, in part, some of the things that Nicephorus had done during his tenure as emperor. So, let's take a look at what Nicephorus did and how that set up the future. So, Nicephorus was an iconophile, but not an extreme one. He wanted to continue Irene's policy of allowing icon worship while not persecuting iconoclasts. This put him in direct conflict with the Zealots, who were iconophiles who wanted to go a step further and punish iconoclasts for what they perceived as their impiety. Nicephorus also found himself at odds with the Zealots because he wanted to uphold the principle that Constantine VI had been trying to establish during the Medicean controversy, as to really increase imperial prerogative. So the idea that Nicephorus takes away from the Medicean controversy is that Constantine VI was trying to establish a precedent whereby the emperor could excuse himself from matters of canon law for the purposes of expediency. So if the emperor needed to remarry in order to sire an offspring, then he could break the prohibition against divorce in the interest of the state. And the Zealots were not having any of that. They were for strict adherence. However, a faction that would later form, known as the Politicians, would support Nicephorus' reading for mostly pragmatic reasons. Another lasting legacy of the Emperor Nicephorus is that when the elderly Patriarch Tarasius died, he appointed Patriarch Nicephorus, who is not a relation, by the way, to succeed him in 806, and the Patriarch Nicephorus would play a fairly large role in the reigns of the Emperor Nicephorus' two successors. In 809, Nicephorus had really been butting heads with the leader of the Zealots, Theodore of Studium, for several years, and he banished him that year. And it's probably due to this conflict and then the banishment of Theodore of Studium that Nicephorus is portrayed very negatively in the sources, and the main source for this period is still Theophanes the Confessor, who is a major zealot and seems to be something of a fanboy of Theodore of Studium. So if you're ever wondering why the sources paint Nicephorus in such a black light, well, there you go. Over the course of his reign, Nicephorus faced two challenges from would-be usurpers. The first was from Bardanes Turcus. Now, Turcus literally means the Turk, but it was probably actually a reference to a Khazar heritage. And Bardanes had been a major supporter of Irene, and in order to try to win him over, Nicephorus had given him a command in Anatolia. and he thought that this would be enough to satisfy Bardanes. However, Bardanes was apparently either loyal to the Empress Irene, or else he was just simply ambitious and he saw the new emperor as vulnerable. So in 803, Bardanes Turcus marched on the capital, but when he failed to attract any popular support, he agreed to retire as a monk, and then later, possibly on Nicephorus's orders, he was blinded. In 808, Arsaber, a patrician and quaestor, was at the head of a conspiracy in February of disgruntled officials who wanted to get rid of Nicephorus. Now, as we'll see, Nicephorus was famous for restoring taxes, and it's possible that these were more or less pissed off aristocrats who did not want to pay taxes. Although I don't really know the details of this conspiracy, and I don't think they were ever recorded, but that's just a guess. At any rate, Arsaber failed, and he was also forced to become a monk and ended up being banished to Bithynia. Rulers can't actually accomplish anything without some source of income that is both regular and substantial. So when he became emperor, Nicephorus's first concern was to restore the regular and full collection of taxes and to end the period of laxity that had taken place under Irene. So in Nicephorus's time in the early 9th century, the state's income came primarily from a land tax based on the quantity and quality of each family's agricultural and pastoral lands. There was also an institution at the time called the Allelangian, which had the village community as a whole make up for any default of payment. And the advantage of this is that the state would always be able to get paid, so revenue would always be insured, while it also had the added benefit of making sure that small farmers didn't get dispossessed. Because when small farmers get dispossessed, then that can lead to the consolidation of land under powerful landowners, and then they can pose a challenge to the state's authority and create some other issues, as we'll see much later in Byzantine history. Not to mention that the theme system seems to have really relied heavily on small holders, so this was one way to make sure that the empire continued to have a large number of small farmers. As I've mentioned several times, it is very difficult to really trace the development of Byzantine institutions with any degree of precision between the years 600 and 800 due to the scarcity and relative low quality of the sources that we have available. However, by the time of Nicephorus, and possibly up to 200 years before, there was a poll tax called the Kopnikon. And what this tax is that it is what is known as a poll tax or a harf tax. And it is due from all of the rural inhabitants of the empire, even those who own no land. So it's basically just a tax that is collected from every family in the empire. And to give you an idea of how far ahead this was of its time, even if we take the late date of Nicephorus and say it's like 805 or something like that, it still is many centuries ahead of France, where they don't have a comparable institution until the 1340s, and in Britain it's sometime in the middle of the 17th century. So this is something that is actually a pretty advanced fiscal institution. The Byzantines were also able to collect high tariffs on all imported goods, the collection of which was generally well regulated since goods were funneled into a small number of entry ports that were easy to regulate for imperial officials. So Nicephorus basically restores all of these things. It doesn't look like he really innovated all that much, but the fact that he was able to restore these things is significant, because a lot of times when institutions start to decline, they tend to stay defunct because there are a lot of powerful interests which are against them getting started again. So Nicephorus was able to do this, and it's possible that at least one of the usurpers who tried to overthrow him was trying to bank on an elite counterreaction to this restoration of taxation. Charlemagne had declared himself to be the emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day of 800, and he had been trying ever since to get the Byzantines to recognize the legitimacy of his claim. He had proposed marriage to the Empress Irene, but her overthrow made that avenue now unfeasible. So his new plan was to get this recognition from the new emperor Nicephorus. In order to put pressure on Nicephorus, Charlemagne started to exert pressure against Byzantine holdings in Italy and made activity north of the Danube, which kind of let the Byzantines know how powerful he was and that he was capable of doing damage. And this activity north of the Danube really lit a fire in Nicephorus, and we'll talk about what his reaction was. As for Nicephorus himself, he had come to power on a wave of disapproval of Irene's possible marriage to Charlemagne and general disapproval of all things Irene. And he had initially resisted Charlemagne's demands, and his response was to actually focus heavily on enhancing Byzantine strength in the Balkans, lest Charlemagne get any ambitions about conquering Eastern Europe. So let's now discuss the so-called Pax Nicephori, the Peace of Nicephorus, which is a little bit of a misnomer since this doesn't really describe something that's very meaningful or long-lived. At any rate, Nicephorus and Charlemagne agreed to open negotiations in 803, but both of them still moved to strengthen their positions in the following years while negotiations continued. During this time, the main bone of contention between the two emperors was that they allowed lots of naval clashes to go down in the Adriatic, and later on the Adriatic would become the settled border between the Byzantine and Frankish worlds. Some scholars actually think that when Michael I ended up recognizing Charlemagne's title, this was actually a confirmation of a decision that had already been reached by Nicephorus, and that Michael I was just upholding his father-in-law's decision. But at any rate, the evidence is not 100% clear. One piece of circumstantial evidence that is kind of significant is that the peace was called the Pax Nicephori, even though the emperor who actually finished it and made it stick for good was Leo V, who ended up overthrowing the dynasty that Nicephorus had started. So maybe that is something to consider. But at any rate, this was a long-term process, and it actually involved 3 other emperors in addition to Nicephorus. Nicephorus had 2 primary objectives for trying to strengthen his hand in the Balkans. One is that gaining more land in the Balkans would be a great deal easier than trying to gain additional territory at the expense of the Abbasids in the east. The second reason is that this would be a good way to try to offset the increasing influence of Charlemagne in Eastern and Central Europe. So, Nicephorus now had to contend with the situation in the Balkans. For the most part, a lot of the lands that he was interested in were under Slavic control, and most of these Slavic groups had not really formed into states that could put up a great deal of resistance. So as long as Nicephorus was able to organize an army and send it in, he should be able to conquer the area. The main obstacle, therefore, was the First Bulgarian Empire in the north, and this was led by Khan Krum, who had come to power around the year 800 and ruled until his death in 814. Now, Krum, for obvious reasons, would not want to see a reassertion of Byzantine authority in the Balkans, since his empire had been born and come to prosperity with the absence of a strong Byzantine presence. Krum was himself a very ambitious ruler, and he pulled off a great achievement in 805 when he finished off the Avar Khaganate and managed to grab all of their remaining lands. Krum's empire was the strongest organized opposition to the reassertion of Byzantine authority, and it would be the First Bulgarian Empire and Khan Krum who would form the greatest enemies of Nicephorus I, and indeed his entire dynasty, such as it was. Nicephorus's main achievement as emperor was the military and administrative gains that he was able to make in the Balkans. And his first step was to reconquer the Peloponnese, so he campaigned there first and was able to conquer that area. In due time, he was able to establish 6 new themes, and these themes were mostly built on existing chunks of territory that he then expanded out and added the hinterlands to. So his 6 new themes were Thrace, Thessalonica, Macedonia, Kephallonia, Dyrrhachium on the west coast of the Balkans, and the Peloponnese in the south. And in order to keep these areas loyal to the empire, what Nicephorus did was to settle loyal groups from elsewhere, and used tribes along the frontier who he knew he could count on, while removing potentially disloyal groups from these sensitive areas and relocating them to other areas where they could cause less turmoil. Now, this population relocations thing is something that Roman and Byzantine rulers had been doing for centuries, and it looks like Nicephorus was the guy who did it most effectively when compared with any of his predecessors. Archaeological evidence shows that the early 9th century was a time of urban revival in the Balkans, and especially in Greece, where Nicephorus was most active. So the question becomes, how much of this newfound prosperity should we attribute to Nicephorus and his policies? And that's not really one that I have a clear answer for at this point. It looks like that the transferred populations from elsewhere served as a catalyst for population recovery over the next couple of centuries. And we also see evidence that for the first time in 2 centuries since the Slavic migrations, that there is imported pottery in the provinces. And in the end, it's not 100% clear how much credit for these developments should go to local growth, how much should go to imperial policy, and how much should go to general recovery and growth in a time when most of Europe was starting to grow as well. So it's really hard to assess, but it does look like Nicephorus's policies had at least some positive effects on the lives of people living in the western part of the Byzantine Empire. Nicephorus's focus was always on the West and the Balkans, and that is best illustrated by the fact that when he was faced with a major invasion from Caliph Harun al-Rashid, that Nicephorus opted to purchase a peace so that he could continue to keep his armies focused on the West. This decision, in light of what happened later, i.e. the Battle of Pliska, may have created some difficulties for his successors in the East, especially Leo V, who reigned from 813 to 820. The reason I say that it may have created some problems for Leo V is that it seems like he came to power at a time when the empire was threatened on all sides, and that had Nicephorus paid closer attention to the East, that this might not have been an issue. However, all that being said, I think that Nicephorus's decision was the correct one. He made a rational choice. If he could restore the power of the West, then this would give his empire more overall power, and the next time he had to clash with the Abbasids, he would be on a much firmer footing. So I think that Nicephorus made the correct and rational decision, but that it ended up having some unintended consequences that Leo V and others had to deal with. By 811, for reasons which are not entirely clear, Nicephorus and Crum found themselves at war. Now, the sources note that Crum was alarmed by Nicephorus's successes, so perhaps he had intervened in some way and managed to attract negative attention of the emperor. It's also simply possible that Nicephorus wanted to restore the Danubian frontier, and that the person in his way was Crum. At any rate, in the summer of 811, Nicephorus set out at the head of a large army, which would have numbered around 50 to 80,000 men, and they marched for Bulgaria. Early on, Crum realized that he was at a massive disadvantage, and he sent out some peace feelers, which Nicephorus rejected, and then pressed on to the Bulgarian capital of Pliska. Crum and his elite 12,000-man standing army came out to try to defeat this Byzantine force, and they were brushed aside. Crum then levied about 50,000 random troops, and they came out and tried to fight the Byzantines, also were defeated, and after that, Nicephorus's men were free to sack Pliska. According to our Byzantine sources, Nicephorus and his men committed some real atrocities, and they were pretty brutal, and this apparently hardened Crum's resolve to punish them. So Crum gathered his men, and he began to try to cut off the mountain passes leading back to the south. So Nicephorus became aware of this, and rather than make the march westward that he had been anticipating, he decided instead to make a beeline back to the capital. And in the process, he ended up falling into a bit of trouble, as we'll see. As he prepared to withdraw from the vicinity of Pliska, Nicephorus chose to take a road leading through the Varbica Pass, and for whatever reason he chose not to scout ahead. Perhaps he thought that the Bulgars were still too disoriented and disorganized to mount a successful resistance. So he and his army began to march through this narrow pass on their way back home. Krum had correctly assumed that this would be Nicephorus's course of action, and he and his men were in ambush all around the pass. For 3 days, Krum had Nicephorus trapped, and basically everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. After 3 days, Krum struck at night on July 26, 811, and the result was one of the greatest military disasters in Byzantine history. Byzantine forces broke almost immediately. In an effort to escape, many men were able to fight their way out of one end of the pass, only to be cornered at a river and ended up drowning in it. A lot of other men died trying to work their way over the ramparts that the Bulgarians had erected within the pass itself. During this fighting, many notable figures were killed, and this includes the Emperor Nicephorus himself. The losses during this battle are unknown, but they are known to have been massive, and this is one of the great military catastrophes in history, possibly going even beyond just Byzantine history. So let's explore the aftermath of Pliska. So after the battle, the Byzantines did not campaign north of the Danube for 150 years. That should give you a pretty good indication of both the material and psychological impact of this battle. It was enough to also make Krum one of the greatest Bulgarian leaders of all time. Hostile historians say that Nicephorus died on top of a dung heap. I bet that he would have died in a much more glorious fashion had he been willing to persecute iconoclasts. Something tells me that is the case. Anyway, after Krum recovered the emperor's body, he mounted his severed head on a spike, inlaid the skull with silver, and used it as a drinking cup. Unfortunately, he only had about 3 more years to enjoy this new prize, as he himself would die in the year 814. Nicephorus's record is checkered. However, there are more credits than debits when we look at his overall legacy. His financial policies, i.e. restoring taxation in the face of elite opposition, and his revival of the Balkans place him in the ranks of the near great emperors just on their own and regardless of any other context. He also stands out as being the first emperor to die in battle since Valens at Adrianople, and also the first and only emperor to become a skull cup. The Balkan territories would be able to sustain the Byzantines following the loss of Asia Minor in the 11th century, so that is his long-term contribution. He single-handedly pretty much prolonged the life of the Byzantine Empire and gave it the strength and fortitude to fight another day when trouble would come their way a few centuries later. So that's a pretty big accomplishment to have to your name. However, on the other hand, his fiasco at Pliska was a tremendous stain on his record. The Battle of Pliska opened up a bitter rivalry with the Bulgars, and their importance as imperial adversaries would increase steadily until the time of Basil II. The Nicephoran dynasty, although it produced 2 more emperors, was effectively over when Nicephorus himself fell dead at Pliska in 811. So had Nicephorus scouted more carefully, or not taken along almost all of his major officials and potential heirs to the battlefield, then history would have gone quite a bit differently. And in many ways, he is responsible for his own downfall, and the fact that he is only near great and not truly great is his own fault, and it would have been preventable had he only managed to either win at Pliska or simply avoid disaster. Today we're going to look at an easily and often overlooked emperor, Staurakius. He is the son of Nicephorus, and he only reigned for a few short months due to circumstances that were beyond his control. Despite the fact that he was co-emperor for nearly a decade and that his father was a controversial and much discussed figure, Staurakius' early life is not well recorded. He was the son of Nicephorus, and we're not really sure who his mother was. Her name is not recorded. His date of birth is generally considered to have been after 778, One modern source that I consulted claims that he would have been about 10 to 12 years old in 803, which would have placed his birth at around 793, give or take. He was elevated to become the co-emperor with his father Nicephorus in December of 803, as Nicephorus sought to really solidify his position after dealing with the usurpation. In 807, there was a bride show, and it looks like Nicephorus selected Stauracius' bride. He selected Theophano of Athens, and the main reason seems to have been that she was a relative of Irene, so this was a way to bring legitimacy back to the family by trying to reconcile with anyone who might have been upset by Irene's death. Now, we noted that Irene was deeply unpopular, however, she did have some supporters, especially in the church. So this could have been a way for Nicephorus to try to shore up his position by marrying his son in the family. At any rate, we actually don't know much about Stauracius' activities as co-emperor, but it does seem that he was responsible for discharging the expected duties of his office, and the first real instance that we have of him doing something is when he is escorting his father on campaign against the Bulgars in 811. Prior to May of 811, we don't know with any certainty where Stauracius was or what he was doing. However, in May of 811, this is when Nicephorus began his fateful invasion of Bulgaria, and on this campaign he decided to bring Stauracius and Stauracius' brother-in-law Michael along. Now, there was an early victory that the Byzantines won that Nicephorus attributed to Stauracius' advice and judgment, and he wrote a communication back to the Senate at Constantinople to just that effect. Now, whether he was just trying to shore up his son's reputation with the people back home, or whether Stauracius had genuinely given a brilliant piece of advice that had turned out in the favor of the Byzantines, is hard to say. However, whatever Stauracius' ability and whatever the abilities that his father had shown for several years, apparently neither of them saw the trap that they were walking into. On July 26, 811, at the Battle of Pliska, Khan Krum managed to lure the Byzantine army into an unfavorable position and inflict a severe defeat upon the Byzantine army. During this battle, Nicephorus was killed in action, and the remnants of his army had to flee as best they could to the protection of Adrianople. During the course of the fighting, Stauracius himself was badly wounded. It looks like his spinal cord was severely damaged, and he ended up being crippled from this wound, which in the course of time, after about 6 months or so, would prove to lead to his death. But at the time, I guess it probably wasn't immediately apparent that this wound would be permanent or fatal, and Stauracius is still technically in charge as co-emperor when they arrive at Adrianople. Despite his severe wounds, Stauracius was declared sole emperor a couple days after the fateful Battle of Pliska. However, Stauracius' friends and advisors did not think that he had all that long to live, and they began to look for potential replacements on the throne. Stauracius might have caught wind of this, and he became very suspicious. At one point, he consulted with one of his advisors on the wisdom of having Michael, his brother-in-law, blinded in order to protect his own hold on the throne, but he was dissuaded from this action by that same advisor who, in fact, had already decided to back Michael as the next emperor. While Stauracius attempted to govern from his sickbed and tried to come up with ways to shore up his tenuous position, 4 senior officials, the Patriarch Nicephorus, the Magister Officiorum Theokistus, the bodyguard captain Stephanus, and Michael Rangabi, debated about what to do and who should become the next emperor. At the same time, however, Stauracius proposed making Theophano the reigning empress in a way that was reminiscent of the way that Irene had become reigning empress. In this case, however, it would be the emperor actually appointing her rather than having an empress seize power. Now, given the way that the Nicephoran dynasty had started, this is a very odd choice, since of course it had been his father Nicephorus who had overthrown Irene, and now his son was proposing to leave the empire in the hands of another woman who was Irene's relative. So that was a fairly desperate proposal, And there is also some mention in the sources of Staurakius coming up with another scheme which would create something like an imperial democracy. I'm not really clear on exactly what that's supposed to be. It could just be a loose use of terminology by the sources about something that he proposed. Maybe he wanted to form a ruling council or invest power in the Byzantine Senate. I don't know. At any rate, it was clear that Staurakius was looking for any way out of this problem other than leaving the office of emperor before he died. By October 2nd, 811, Staurakius no longer had any need for far-fetched schemes of imperial succession, as on that day news reached him that the Senate had just declared Michael as the new emperor. Staurakius was in no condition to contest this, so he simply abdicated in order to save his own life, and he took monastic vows. Michael agreed to let him live out his life, short as that was going to be. It's really hard to assess the legacy of someone who only ruled for 3 months and was barely able to exercise power within that time. But from what little we can gather about Staurakius, he seems to have had a very strong will, as evidenced by how hard he tried to come up with creative ways to retain his power. And it's also possible, if Nicephorus's report was to be believed, that his son Staurakius did have some degree of tactical talent, even if that was not sufficiently developed to save them from disaster at Pliska. If a lot of modern scholars write and Nicephorus was only about 20 or so, then we have to wonder what he could have become if he had that natural tactical talent and he has this iron will and a lot of the intelligence of his father Nicephorus. What could he have gone on to become had he survived the disaster? At any rate, he didn't really survive the disaster in any meaningful way and ended up dying of gangrene or some other infection from his battle wounds on January 11th, 812. Of all the people we've covered so far, I think that Staurakius' life is one of the richest in terms of the alternate history possibilities. But at any rate, he didn't really end up doing all that much in his lifetime due to bad luck. So I'll leave it there, and next time we'll discuss the life of Michael I Rangabi, Staurakius' much luckier brother-in-law. In 811, Michael I Rangabi inherited one of the worst situations that any emperor had faced in recent memory, and by 813 he had been deposed by a rival. Most historians tend to view Michael as being inept and completely unsuited for imperial command. So in this video I want to examine that. Was Michael the supreme bungler, or was he simply placed in a situation that was untenable and that even a much more talented ruler could not have succeeded in? Let's find out by taking a look at Michael's life and reign. The future Emperor Michael was born around 770, and he was the son of a prominent patrician named Theophylact Rangabi, who was the admiral of the Aegean fleet. At some point in his adult life, Michael married Nicephorus's daughter Procopia. Now, this marriage took place prior to Nicephorus's rise to power, and it doesn't appear to have been politically motivated, i.e., Nicephorus did not seek out Michael as a son-in-law to shore up his imperial administration, and Michael was not using Procopia as a way to get to power. I mean, most likely this marriage had some aristocratic underpinnings that aren't clear right now, and it was mutually beneficial to both families, since that tends to be how aristocratic marriages work, but there's really no reason to suspect that either Michael or his father-in-law Nicephorus knew that imperial power was in their immediate future. And as I mentioned earlier, Michael's family was a noble one. They were patricians, and Michael, because he is the first emperor to have a family name, Rangabi, this is seen as being emblematic of the rise of distinctive aristocratic houses, and we'll see that a lot of future emperors after Michael will also have family names like this. And I might be wrong on this, but I think that Theophylact Rangabi may have actually been the first person listed, at least in the sources, to have a distinctive family name like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not 100% on that, like I said. In the summer of 811, the Emperor Nicephorus embarked upon his fateful Bulgar campaign, which culminated in the Battle of Pliska. Unfortunately, Nicephorus took a whole host of senior officials with him, including his son and heir Staurakius and his son-in-law Michael Rangabi. Unlike most of the other senior leaders present at Pliska, Michael was not only able to escape, but he escaped unharmed. So he had his full health, and this piece of good luck, when compared with the horrible fates of so many others, especially Nicephorus, who became a drinking cup, and his son Staurakius, who was mortally wounded, this may have given Michael something of an aura of divine protection or destiny, and this may have played a role in making him appear to be an imperial contender, whereas he might not have been regarded in that light before this. The catastrophe at Pliska occurred on July 26, 811, and for the next 3 months, the future of the empire remained in doubt. Now, Staurakius had been co-emperor with his father Nicephorus since 803, and now he just assumed sole command of the empire. However, it was pretty obvious to everyone that he was mortally wounded, and that he was not physically capable of sustaining life long enough to rule the empire effectively for any extended period of time. So a lot of people began to look for other options. Staurakius doesn't seem to have really accepted his fate, however, and he was trying to set up his wife as a potential successor. And for reasons that we don't know, Staurakius neither liked nor trusted Michael, and at one point he tried to order one of his subordinates to put Michael to death, but he was talked out of it. Meanwhile, while all of this was going on, maybe Staurakius' suspicions were correct, because Michael was working with these senior officials, including the Patriarch Nicephorus, and the official whose name I can't remember, who was the guy talking with Staurakius about killing Michael, and they all decided as a group that Michael should be the next emperor. So they worked together to secure his elevation, and Michael decided to take his son Theophylact as his co-emperor. This elevation occurred in public in Constantinople in October of 811, and when Staurakius received news of it, he knew that the jig was up. He accepted Michael's elevation and abdicated. He became a monk until his death in early 812, where his wounds finally took him. And now Michael I Rangabi was the emperor. So let's look at how Michael performed as emperor. Once Michael became emperor in October of 811, it quickly became apparent that he was not a very good emperor. He just really didn't have it. So on paper, he had experience, and he also had a lot of good connections. As we've seen, his father was a famous admiral. His father-in-law ended up becoming emperor. He came from a house which was prominent enough to have a name, something that was a new trend, and meant that his family was one of the most powerful in the state. So you would think that between all of these things that he was pretty well off, not to mention that he had managed to work with all of the remaining senior imperial officials, including the Patriarch, and he had all of them on his side. He was at a pretty favorable age for rulership. He was around 40, which means that he was old enough to have experience and command respect, but he wasn't old. He was healthy. We know that just by the fact that he lives for a long time after his reign ends. And he was also considered to be handsome, which would have helped him be more charming and, get along with people. So on paper, you would think that Michael seems like a pretty good candidate. However, it turns out that he is pretty easy to manipulate, especially in matters of religion. And this is because Michael was driven by an excessive piety. And because of his overweening desire to really please the ecclesiastical figures of his day, he became a puppet in the hands of people like Patriarch Nicephorus and Theodore of Studium, the famous zealot monk. Another problem with Michael is that he tended to not be very decisive. He was pretty hard-pressed to make decisions in a timely fashion, and to put it bluntly, he just wasn't all that intelligent. At least not on matters of state. So between all of these flaws, he was pretty hopeless when it came to being an emperor in a time of crisis. So what exactly did Michael inherit, and how dire was the crisis? In 811, the Byzantine state was now on solid financial footing thanks to the work of Nicephorus. However, it was also militarily exposed in the west thanks to Nicephorus. The debacle at Pliska had really eliminated the western army, and the Byzantines would be vulnerable in the west for a few years. His key advisors at this time were the Patriarch Nicephorus and Theodore of Studium. Now, as mentioned above, these two guys had a lot of influence with Michael because he admired their piety and positions within the church. However, the two of them gave contradictory advice and were bitter arch rivals. Patriarch Nicephorus was someone who was a member of, I guess, what you would call the power establishment, whereas Theodore of Studium was someone who was for the strict enforcement of church law, and those two views were not very easily compatible. Michael also inherited the diplomatic problem of dealing with Charlemagne's imperial claims. These claims were still deeply distasteful to the Byzantine emperors because these claims took away what made them special. So Michael would have to deal with that. But the main challenge, again, comes from this military exposure post-Pliska, and that threat is posed in the person of Khan Krum of the Bulgars, the guy who had inflicted the defeat at Pliska. So these are the primary challenges that Michael will deal with in the less than 2 years that he holds the throne. Early on, after he is selected, he enjoys 2 lavish coronation ceremonies about a week apart for himself and then for his wife. And between those 2 events, I would have to say that marks the peak of Michael I's reign. Once he came to power, Michael's first concern was to try to consolidate power, and the best way to do that was to make friends with all the people who could be potential rivals or enemies. So first of all, he eased up on Nicephorus's tax collection. Now, this may seem foolhardy at first since he had a new army he needed to build. However, the elite landowning class was always a potential threat, and this was one of Michael's methods for trying to win their favor. He also distributed generous gifts to the army, church, and bureaucracy to win their favor as well, since being opposed by major figures in the church could make him unpopular with the people, and the army posed pretty obvious threats. He also agreed to recognize Charlemagne's claim partially. So he agreed to recognize Charlemagne as Basileus, the Greek word for king, which by this point basically meant emperor. Most of the Byzantine emperors called themselves Basileus as their primary title, even if that was not technically correct. But Michael did not acknowledge Charlemagne as emperor of the Romans, so it was kind of a weird passive-aggressive solution, and I think it was mainly aimed at his own subjects who could potentially be aggrieved if he were to simply accept Charlemagne's claims. So he accepted enough of Charlemagne's claims to keep peace between the 2 empires, but also, still didn't give him what he had asked for exactly. So it's definitely a passive-aggressive move, but it, in this one instance, actually ended up not being a bad one. This was maybe Michael's greatest policy. And a lot of people think that this was a negotiation that had already been decided by Nicephorus and that all Michael did was just sign off on it. But again, it's kind of hard to know. The evidence is not entirely clear on exactly when this agreement was made and then when it was signed, although we do know it was definitely signed, I think, actually under Leo V, so a little bit later still than Michael. But at any rate, either Nicephorus or Michael was the one who negotiated it. And it does show a lot of continuity between different emperors, that they all were on the same page about this. So it's possible it was actually just some advisor who came up with this, and it had very little to do with any of the 3 emperors I just mentioned. But anyway, let's move on and talk about Michael's real problems. In the spring of 812, Khan Krum seized Develtis. This was a fortified Byzantine town on the Black Sea coast, and it controlled a coastal road that was pretty vital for trade. Krum relocated a lot of the inhabitants there to his own lands, and that included a bishop. So for Michael, this was an outrage and something that he would have to address. So he mobilized his army in June, and he marched out to try to find and confront Crum. Unfortunately, his army was newly raised, not really trained, and not very well disciplined, so they mutinied early on and prevented Michael from making a date with Crum. So this caused a widespread panic among Byzantine subjects in Thrace and Macedonia, and many of them fled to safer regions. So at this point, it looked like Michael was in danger of allowing the gains that Nicephorus had made in the Balkans to slip away. So he had to do something to shore up his army. At this point, Michael surely had the wherewithal to realize that his army was unable to cope with the threat that it faced in 812, but it would be several months before his army was able to cope with the Bulgars. In the meanwhile, his lands were being laid waste, and he was losing key frontier strongholds. The cities of Ankylius and Barrow both fell. Those were key frontier strongholds, and you can imagine that this would have been very frustrating to army officials who knew that these areas would be very difficult to reclaim. The panic spread as far south as Philippolis, which was the chief city of western Thrace, and this also means that the Byzantine officials in cities like Adrianople and elsewhere are probably having to deal with a bit of a refugee crisis. So I'm sure that they also were not very pleased with the way that things had gone. At this point, things were looking pretty bad, and Crum proposes peace on the condition that Michael hand over all of the Bulgar prisoners and deserters. There were probably still quite a number from the early stages of the Pliska campaign when Nicephorus' forces had actually been fairly successful. However, for whatever reason, Michael found that to be unacceptable, and he rejected the offer. And Crum's counter was to lay siege to the city of Mesembria, which was a long, slender peninsula. And this should not have been a major problem. In theory, the Byzantine fleet should be able to easily resupply this place. It's not somewhere that you can take by land without a fleet, and Crum had no fleet. The Byzantines did. However, for whatever reason, the Byzantine navy was not really up to par. And it's kind of an unaccountable thing, and it must have been especially embarrassing given Michael's naval roots and his father's reputation as an admiral. So, without this Byzantine naval support, the city of Mesembria goes hungry, and they're forced to surrender on November 5th. And this might actually be the worst single event of the year 812 for Michael. Going into 813, it was pretty clear to Michael that he was in a lot of trouble. He knew that his only real chance of trying to save his throne was to meet and defeat Crum in an open battle, and even then his position would not be fully secure unless he was able to win further successes in other arenas. But you had to start somewhere. The disasters that had occurred since Pliska had really helped to revive the iconoclast cause, and even some of Constantine V's elderly sons were hopeful that they might get a shot at the throne. A lot of them had been mutilated, so I'm not really sure exactly what hope they realistically had, but hey, who knows? I guess hope springs eternal. Generals and troops in Asia had to be brought over to really shore up Michael's army, and they were not impressed by Michael's generalship early on as he led them out in the field and delayed the engagement with Crum's army. So they were out in the field for a couple months not really doing anything before Michael started to move them toward a position where they might actually find Crum. In the summer of 813, Michael took his newly reinforced army into the field in Thrace and proceeded to not really do anything for an entire month. And if you're wondering why that's a problem, here's why. If you know anything about Roman or Byzantine armies, you know that they are very easily offended by their commanders. And the worst way to offend them, other than not paying them, is to refrain from engaging in battle, because they take that as an insult to their fighting prowess, because if their general believed in them properly and understood their true combat value, then he would not show such hesitancy. So by showing this hesitancy, Michael was alienating his troops. Eventually, though, Michael does enter into enemy territory, and by this point, this enemy territory extends pretty close to his own borders. They ended up engaging not far from Adrianople at a place called Versinicia. And in general, the Bulgars had a policy of avoiding major battles, with the exception of Pliska, where they had ambushed a Byzantine army passing through a narrow area. The Bulgars were not really fond of open battles, and this had been a strategy that served them pretty well. However, for whatever reason, Krum felt pretty confident, and Michael was eventually goaded by his generals and men into attacking on June 21st. The battle was actually going pretty well at first, and it had kind of proved the former wisdom of Krum to not engage in open battles, as he was on the, cusp of receiving a major defeat. But then, unexpectedly, the Anatolian troops under the general Leo the Armenian quit the field, and that was half the army. And then that left Krum alone, where he could rally his men and win the battle. Now, there are quite a few suspicions about what happened and whether this was prearranged between Leo and Krum, but I won't get into that until I talk about Leo V. So, we'll save that discussion for a future date. But at any rate, the Battle of Versinicia resulted in yet another great victory for Krum and another crushing and humiliating defeat for the Byzantines. And this time, it was a completely avoidable defeat that the Byzantines should not have suffered, so it kind of makes it worse in a way. Quick note, if you happen to catch a hint of some kind of tune in the background, that is because one of my neighbors has their stereo cranked all the way up, and I can't really do anything about that. So, bonus points to anyone who can hear it and guess what song is currently playing. We'll see if anyone is able to figure it out, or if it's even audible. At any rate, after the disaster at Versinicia, Krum was then able to march all the way to Constantinople and camp beneath the walls in July. And between the defection, the defeat, and then Krum being camped at the gates, Michael's spirit was totally broken, and he supposedly said something to the effect that God must not like the dynasty of Nicephorus. And when he reached the city of Constantinople, he met with Patriarch Nicephorus and told him that it was his intention to abdicate from the throne. And for his part, the Patriarch did not object. He thought that, yeah, Michael kind of sucked at being emperor. So Michael abdicated and became a monk. And let's look at his long post-imperial career briefly. The post-imperial career of Michael I closely mirrors that of Theodosius III a century before. Both men entered the church along with their sons, and in both cases, both men found peace in their new profession, and both of their sons found great success within the church. So, let's take a look here. After his abdication in 813, Michael took the monastic name of Athanasius and lived peacefully until his death in 844. So he ended up enjoying a pretty long life, which is fairly unusual for someone who was emperor and then was deposed. Michael's sons, unfortunately for them, were castrated and also forced to go into monasteries, lest they take up the banner of the Nicephoran dynasty at a later date. One son, Nicetas, took the monastic name Ignatius and later became the Patriarch of Constantinople, and he actually was a pretty famous one at that. This is a drawing of him in a church. So, pretty successful post-imperial career all in all, and that is, again, not a thing that is very common in Byzantine history. So it points to maybe the fact that Michael I was not someone who was actually all that eager to rule, and he certainly wasn't going to fight for a throne that he thought was not destined to remain his. The legacy of Michael I Rangabi is a bit difficult to assess. His weakness nearly undid all of Nicephorus's gains in the Balkans. However, he didn't reign long enough or fail hard enough to make that happen, so it ended up not really being much of a legacy in that respect. His failure also ensured the end of the Nicephoran dynasty, and of course his abdication included his sons getting castrated, so that also brought an end to the Rangabi family. But this failure, compounded upon the failures that had occurred all the way dating back to Irene, and then really brought home by Pliska and Versinicia, really set the stage for a second round of iconoclasm. So I would say that if any one person was really central in inadvertently making the case for iconoclasm to come back, it was actually Michael the First. And if I had to really assess him overall, I mean, Michael the First Rangabi was one of the least talented emperors in Byzantium's history. This guy was simply not suited for imperial power. He didn't have it. But he doesn't really seem to have been a bad person. People seem to have liked him relatively well. He seems to have been trustworthy to the point that someone like Leo V could allow him to go into a monastery and never really have to worry about Michael reemerging or betraying the agreement that they had reached. So there are some honorable traits to Michael, even if he really is not very talented or impressive in any other respect. Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. Generally speaking, when we think of Byzantine emperors who stand out from the rest in our imaginations, we tend to think of guys who either achieved great military glory, engaged in a hell of a lot of intrigue, took part in a lot of coups, engaged in all kinds of harebrained assassination attempts, or were at the center of various religious controversies. In the case of Leo V, he checks all of those boxes with the exception of winning any sort of great military glory. So, I wonder, why is he not a more well-known Byzantine emperor? I don't know exactly why, but if I had to guess, I would say that it has something to do with his slavish imitation of Leo III and the fact that he fell a little short of Leo III. So today, let's look at the life and times of Leo V and explore why, even if he's not among the great emperors of Byzantium, he is among the most interesting. Leo the Armenian actually had a very interesting life before becoming emperor. His father was the Armenian patrician Bardas, and he also had some Syrian heritage. This means that from an ethnic perspective, he was a little bit of an outsider in Constantinople, but because of his patrician rank, you can't really call him an outsider, and he would have had access to political power and inner circles in Constantinople for his entire life. He was born around the year 775 CE, which makes him about 5 or so years younger than his predecessor, Michael I. He first enters the historical record in 803, when he served under the rebel Bardanes Turkos. And as the likely outcome of Bardanes' usurpation became clear, Leo read the tea leaves and defected to Nicephorus I. He seems to have been rewarded for his conduct for defecting. Later on, he somehow managed to lose Nicephorus' favor, and he was stripped of the thematic command that he had been awarded. The sources are a bit divided on this. It looks like either he was punished for marrying Arsaber's daughter, and Arsaber was another guy who tried to challenge Nicephorus for the throne, or else he suffered a defeat at the hands of the Arabs, and he was punished accordingly. It's really hard to say. And because Leo had such a penchant for engaging in intrigue later, I think most people favor the idea that he was trying to marry Arsaber's daughter and stir up trouble, and that's why Nicephorus put a stop to it. Of course, Nicephorus died famously at Pliska in 811, and his successor, Michael I Rangabi, was on the throne for 2 years, and he was politically inept and in search of allies, and he found one in Leo the Armenian, because Leo was someone who was currently without a job, and he thought that he could win Leo's loyalty by making him a governor again. So he appointed Leo to the Anatolic theme, and in that office, Leo managed to win a victory over the Arabs in Cilicia in 812. So after that, of course, Michael decided that Leo could be a go-to general, and he tried to bring him into Europe to help him fight the Bulgars, which ended up being the most fatal decision of Michael's career. By the summer of 813, Leo and his Anatolian troops had arrived in Europe, and they were to serve as a backbone for Michael's army. Michael had a lot of new recruits in his army after the disaster at Pliska a couple years before, and a lot of these men were not up to snuff yet. So the idea was that these troops from Asia would really provide a backbone and get the army in Europe back on its feet, and in the meantime help deal with the Bulgar crisis. And of course, Leo was going to be the commander of that wing of the army. Now, earlier, before the Battle of Versinicia, there was about a month or so where Michael was just dithering around in Thrace and not really campaigning in earnest, and that really helped alienate the Anatolian troops and also didn't impress anyone in particular. It's probable that if these troops were grumbling and unhappy, that Leo either fed into that in some way, or else he realized what the public mood was and tapped into it in some way. During the actual battle at Versinicia on June 22nd of 813, approximately 2 years after the disaster at Pliska, the Byzantines were actually winning the battle at first, and the Bulgars were on the verge of being routed. But then, Leo and his men departed from the field. They just withdrew. And that allowed Krum to rally his Bulgars, counterattack, and win another significant victory. One interesting question that is raised by the odd sequence of events at Versinicia is whether or not Leo's betrayal of Michael was done in collusion with Khan Krum. Now, it's almost certain that Leo had a plan before he betrayed Michael, given his well-known proclivity for using deception and ruses to get his way. We'll see over the course of his career that he uses ruse after ruse after ruse to get what he wants. The question is, was Leo actually working with Khan Krum, or was the Bulgar victory at Versinicia an unfortunate side effect of his betrayal? I tend to fall on the side of Versinicia being an accidental disaster, that Leo wanted Krum to win, but not by a lot, just enough to fully finish discrediting Michael and allow him to seize power. But the fact that Khan Krum was able to turn that into a full-blown victory was not something that Leo was counting on. And I also don't necessarily think that Leo and Khan Krum were actually in direct communication, but they may well have been. Ultimately, there is insufficient information to make a determination, but it is interesting to think about. The combination of betrayal and yet another massive battlefield defeat completely broke what remained of Michael Rangabi's spirit, and he was ready and willing to abdicate. So he named Leo as his co-emperor, and then he stepped down from power, and that avoided any need for a civil war. Leo V took the precaution of having Michael's sons castrated, but he did allow the Rangabi men to live out their lives as monks, and you can learn a little bit more about that by watching my video on Michael I. In order to secure Patriarch Nicephorus's blessing, Leo V swore that his views were orthodox, and he even showed respect to the prominent icon over the Chalky Gate as proof of his orthodoxy. The reason why Nicephorus would probably suspect that Leo's views were a bit off is because Leo had so much Eastern heritage, and because people from the eastern parts of the empire tended to be iconoclast. And it would turn out that if Nicephorus harbored those suspicions, that he was right. Upon seizing control, Leo V inherited the Bulgar problem that was created by the disaster at Pliska, and then further exacerbated by his own actions. Krum was greatly emboldened by his latest success at Versinicia, which was, I believe, the first time that he had taken his army out and engaged the Byzantines in a head-on conflict, and actually managed to achieve victory. Normally the Bulgars avoided such things because the Byzantine army was much better suited for straight-out set-piece battles. But at any rate, Krum was now camped beneath the walls of Constantinople, and there he was engaging in pagan ceremonies and also making displays of strength. And both of those things would have been offensive to the people of Constantinople because they undermined the Christian and imperial pretensions of the Byzantine people. Krum demanded that he be allowed to fix his lance on the Golden Gate in order to symbolize his achievements over the last several years and his dominance over Byzantium. Leo predictably refused this offer, and Krum, in retaliation, and in order to convince Leo to accept his symbolic victory, spent several days laying waste to the area outside of the city. Krum then proposed new peace talks, with his price being a large quantity of gold in order to depart, and also a bevy of local beautiful women to take back to Bulgaria with him. When Leo heard the news that Crum wanted to talk, he agreed to meet, and the two of them agreed to meet at the point of the Golden Horn without arms and with minimal attendance. Crum, by all indications, seems to have been acting in good faith, and he was serious about wanting to get his gold and his women and leave. However, Leo decided that this would be a great opportunity to snuff him out. So Leo agreed to meet, and he did so in bad faith, and he placed some assassins nearby and had them in wait. Now, as soon as they met, they were exchanging pleasantries, and Crum noticed that one of Leo's officials made an artificial gesture by rubbing his face, something like that, something that didn't really seem natural or appropriate, and he correctly interpreted that as a gesture to go ahead with a plan. So Crum immediately sprang onto his horse and rode away, barely escaping. Now, one can't help but wonder, what if Leo had actually employed a competent assassin like a Desmond Miles or a Corvo Attano? How different would history have gone? Well, we'll never know, because he apparently just hired the guys who gave us the Bay of Pigs. At any rate, though, the assassination attempt backfired in the worst way possible, because the Khan was only slightly wounded, but extremely pissed by the way that events had unfolded, and this will up the intensity of the war between Byzantium and the Bulgars to a new level of brutality that it had not yet achieved. After the assassination attempt, Crum seems to have been fully convinced that there was no point in negotiating with an enemy that you couldn't trust to keep their word, and he decided to up the ante of his brutality in order to bring Byzantium to heel. So Crum devastated the suburbs near the Golden Horn, and during that campaign he managed to carry off some marble columns, which he sent to his capital at Pliska. During the course of his campaign, he destroyed the city of Salimbria and nearly also captured the city of Heraclea, which barely held out. A lot of Byzantine citizens were spooked by the coming of Crum's army, and many people attempted to flee as refugees, but Crum dedicated resources to hunting them down in the hills and killing them. Crum then joined his brother's forces, which had been besieging Adrianople this whole time, and he helped to bring that siege to an end. He captured 10,000 or so locals, including the archbishop, and had them all killed. So as you can imagine, now Leo is feeling pressure to retaliate in kind, and that's exactly what he does. Due to Leo's failed assassination attempt, Crum's anger and brutality rose to a new level, and Leo was placed in a somewhat awkward situation where he didn't really have an adequate way to respond. On the one hand, it's pretty clear that Crum's army at this point was stronger and that Leo could not fight him in a head-on conflict, which meant that he was more or less powerless to prevent his subjects from getting massacred by Crum's main army. On the other hand, he did have enough of a military that he had to take some actions, and he would have to hit the Bulgars where they were weakest. So this was completely inadequate, but it was better than doing nothing, and it would hopefully help legitimate him in the eyes of his subjects. So some action was necessary. So Leo took his army and launched a surprise attack on a Bulgar army camped near Mesembria, a city which had fallen under Michael I, and he took this army by surprise and supposedly killed them while they slept. So that was a minor but meaningful victory, and it also showed a change in direction, since Michael had allowed the city to fall and now Leo had retaken it. Leo, rather than confronting the main Bulgar army, decided instead to enter Bulgar territory and attack civilians the way that Crum had been attacking his civilians. And he came up with a weird way of going about that. He spared the adults, but smashed their children's heads against rocks. And as you can imagine, these actions further enraged Crum, who now was resolved to capture Constantinople. Maybe he had thought that renewing hostilities and really upping the ante would bring Leo to the table, and in earnest, but that's not what happened. So now Crum believes that the only way to deal with the Byzantine threat once and for all is to destroy them and kick them out of Europe altogether. During the spring of 814, both Leo V and Crum were in the midst of furious preparations for the coming siege of Constantinople. Leo V went as far as to send envoys to Louis the Pious of the Franks, who had just succeeded his father Charlemagne, and he was asking for help in the form of a Frankish attack on the western frontiers of the Bulgars. However, Louis was preoccupied with other issues, and he said that he was not going to be able to help, which meant that Leo was on his own. And at this point, Leo and the Byzantines were pretty worried because they were in serious danger. They had lost quite a number of men, and they didn't know for sure if they were going to be able to hold off the Bulgars without suffering the loss of all of the gains that Nicephorus had made in the Balkans. However, fortune was on the side of the would-be assassins, because on April 13, 814, Crum ended up dropping dead of probably natural causes, and then peace broke out in earnest. Crum's son and successor Omertag had some internal problems. He was a young ruler, and he was apparently challenged by some of his aristocrats, so he had more things to worry about, and at this time it looks like Louis might have changed his mind about intervening on the western frontier, since Omertag was more worried about the Franks for most of his reign than about the Byzantines. Leo V, after this, at some unknown point, began a new policy that his successors would then intensify. And this new policy is to send out missionaries to convert the Bulgars to Christianity. Now, this ended up failing, but it did set a precedent that Byzantium would follow to great effect later, and that would be in the same 9th century, and the two guys on your screen are Cyril and Methodius, the brothers who helped to convert the Slavs to Christianity. Ironically, given the way that Leo V rose to power and then twice intensified the danger which his empire faced, his reign was actually mostly peaceful. He was the primary beneficiary of what is known as the Pax Nicephori. So, let's look at the empire's strategic situation now that Crum is dead. Crum's death means that Leo V was able to arrange peace in the Balkans with Crum's young son Omertag, who would be kept busy doing other things. That meant that now he could help consolidate the gains that Nicephorus had made, and that his subjects in the Balkans would now be able to get on with their lives and increase the prosperity and imperial control there. Out east, the new Abbasid Caliph Mamun was distracted by internal issues that were similar to the ones facing Omertag, and it would be a while before the Abbasids would be able to mount another major challenge to the Byzantines. In the west, the peace with Charlemagne and the Franks held as well, and that is technically what the Pax Nicephori is. The Frankish realm at this time was still united under Louis the Pious, so it was still a major potential rival to Byzantium if they were unfriendly, but they would remain friendly, and then ultimately after Louis the Pious it would divide among his sons. But that is still a ways off, and Leo V will not live to see that happen. So the effect of all this, of having peace with all of their major potential enemies, is that now Leo will have time to pursue his domestic agenda, and you probably already know this, but it will involve icons. If you'll recall, Leo III the Isaurian had come to power during a time of chaos. He had been a strong strategos in the east, and then he had overthrown a weak, unpopular emperor, Theodosius III. Leo V had been a strategos of a theme in the east, and then he had overthrown a weak and unpopular emperor, Michael I Rangabi. So up to this point, their careers are pretty similar. And it appears that these parallels were very obvious to Leo V, and he tried to deepen that connection and really reinforce it. So to make sure that everyone else saw the connection as well, Leo actually renamed his son and heir Constantine, because Leo III's son was the famous Constantine V, who had been the most successful emperor in recent memory, and was still somewhat of the pattern for what a successful emperor during this period looked like. Now, formerly, young Constantine's name had been Symbadios, but, of course, he would never be called that again. Leo also made the connection stronger by establishing political connections and friendship with the various descendants of Constantine V. And there's another connection that he was making. and that was with the still alive and well iconoclast faction within the empire. Now, during the last few reigns from Irene on, we haven't really talked about the iconoclast faction, but they're still there, and they still have some juice, and Leo V is tapping into that. As a good and dutiful student and imitator of Leo III, Leo V understood that the empire had done well during the period of iconoclasm from 730 to 787, and then had struggled after 787 when Irene had restored the icons. And using this rather simplistic reading of history, Leo V was determined to forge ahead and ban the icons again. He seems to have genuinely believed that iconoclasm was the preference of God, and that icons were offensive to God, and that was the root of Byzantium's problems. That was the genuine belief of all of the iconoclasts, so far as I can tell. Now, John Julius Norwick is of the opinion that Leo V's iconoclasm was a purely pragmatic means of trying to appease discharged landless vets that Irene had recruited from the east, and who were still in a position to stir up trouble in Constantinople now that they were discharged and jobless. That may be a very minor factor, but I really don't think that was the primary motivation. I think that Leo V was dedicated to imitating Leo III, and that he was very sincere in his belief about icon policy. So at first, Leo V tried to work with Patriarch Nicephorus on this project, but the Patriarch balked since he was orthodox and in favor of icons, and so Leo had to make some false assurances and then start to work on some underhanded means of getting to his objectives. As part of his plan to institute iconoclasm, Leo V decides that he wants to have intellectual backing for his ideas, and he decides to set up a commission of learned theologians under the young but talented John de Grammarian, and their job will be to amass support for iconoclasm by reviewing the scriptures and patristic literature. He has John's commission set up in seclusion at the palace, and they work for several months, and their job ultimately is to give Leo V the intellectual ammunition that he needs to get through a church council and to make sure that the icons are banished once again. In this sense, it looks like Leo V was actually imitating Constantine V rather than Leo III, since Constantine V had been the great intellectual of iconoclasm in the 8th century. So it looks like Leo V knew his history very well when it comes to how do you institute iconoclasm. Entering the year 815, Leo V was still not fully secure in his imperial authority. He had only been in power for about a year and a half, which means he had only had so much time to place his supporters in positions of power. The Patriarch was unfriendly to his designs, and he also had presided over some major catastrophes in the Balkans in the form of the massacres that Krum had inflicted on Byzantine subjects. So it's safe to say that Leo V was not extremely popular, and he didn't have a super mandate to go out and just act on fiat. So he'd have to move cautiously and with a great deal of wile if he wanted to achieve his ends in a timely fashion. His main goal, once again in direct imitation of Leo III, was to remove the icon over the main gate of Chowki Palace, and to do this, he wanted the support of Patriarch Nicephorus and Theodore Studium. He tried to sell it to them as a pragmatic move. Maybe he pointed out that the large number of soldiers from the east would find it offensive, and that it would be a way to appease them without really doing anything beyond the symbolic. But they protested vociferously, and they saw it as a slippery slope which would lead right back to iconoclasm. They too probably knew that Leo III had taken down that icon, and then 4 years later had instituted iconoclasm. So they were not going to be party to that. In response, Leo knew now he couldn't work with the authorities as they were, so he ordered all of the iconodules, at least the well-known ones, to be placed under house arrest, and then he sent his soldiers to start a riot about the icon, so that way he could send in other soldiers to remove it on the pretext that he was safeguarding it from vandalism. So this was very much a manufactured crisis, and Leo V made the most of his opportunity. This probably also was somewhat of a test to see how the public would respond to the removal of the icon, to see if people would be outraged that it wasn't there anymore, or whether they would be happy, or whether they would just be more or less indifferent to it. And apparently the results that he got were the results that he was looking for. In 815, Leo V felt confident enough to call for a church council, but he carefully controlled the invites so that iconoclasts would have a clear majority and they would win pretty much no matter what. Patriarch Nicephorus was then summoned to preside over this assembly, but he was unable to attend due to illness, so rather than waiting for him to recover, Leo declared him deposed and appointed Theodore Cassiterius, a relative of Constantine V, to be the new patriarch. The meeting ended up being contentious and included some physical altercations. Later on, the fact that this meeting had included some degree of violence helped to undermine its legitimacy in the minds of iconophile historians and theologians. Ultimately, however, this meeting was successful at banning the icons once again. The second coming of iconoclasm was engineered by the second coming of Leo III, and it showed. Leo V was not interested in persecuting iconophiles. His interest was more or less entirely about banning public displays of icons, and if his motives were mostly pragmatic, then maybe he thought that God would only punish the Byzantines if the Byzantine state was endorsing icons. Maybe that was his operating assumption. At any rate, if any citizen found an icon, they were entitled to seize and destroy it without penalty. But if people were caught with icons other than having those icons destroyed, they wouldn't really be punished. In effect, monks and others were known to use icons and to be on the iconophile side of the spectrum, and people more or less left them alone to do what they wanted in private. The one person who ended up being punished was Theodore of Studium, who probably had a bit of a martyr's complex, so he deliberately sought punishment so he could be punished for his views. And he only was punished by Leo V once he really went too far and tried to involve Pope Paschal I in Byzantine affairs. And if you are the emperor or patriarch, invoking the Pope and getting him involved in your affairs in the East is the ultimate no-no for any Byzantine subject, and I think that one could make the argument that Theodore Studium got exactly what he deserved for undermining the emperor's authority in that way. Like all of the iconoclast emperors, Leo V is portrayed negatively by Theophanes the Confessor. However, there are some things in his story which are a little too weird to chalk up to just straight up prejudice against iconoclast. And we're about to see one of the weirdest events in Byzantine history, if not the weirdest event. So, the years 815-820, outside of the iconoclast controversy, seem to have been pretty peaceful. But there was intrigue afoot, and theological tension could help drive that intrigue. At some point, Leo V had a falling out with his old friend Michael the Amorian. The reasons for this are not clear, but they were probably personal, and eventually Leo V orders Michael to be executed. And he comes up with a really bizarre way to have Michael executed. Michael was to be tied to an ape and then cast into the furnaces beneath the baths of the imperial palace, where he would either be maimed by the ape or, die of dehydration and heat stroke. So in either way, he lost. But because Christmas was coming up, Leo decided to delay the execution until after Christmas, so Michael was left in his cell. And during that delay, Michael's supporters got together and organized. And they dressed up as choir members during Christmas Mass, and they approached the altar of the Hagia Sophia, and then they murdered Leo V in front of the public and proclaimed Michael II as the new emperor of Byzantium. My guess is that Michael the Amorian was involved in some kind of coup, or he was plotting in some way, or maybe he was even having an affair with the Empress, something of that nature. But at any rate, we don't really know for sure. All we know is that he became the central figure in the resistance to Leo V, and that the conspirators rallied around Michael the Amorian. We'll get more into the details of that when we talk about Michael II's life. So, what was the legacy of Leo V the Armenian? The main thing, above all else, is that by helping to restore the peace, he helped to secure all of the gains that Byzantium had made in the Balkans, and he set the empire up to continue its revival. Basically, if Nicephorus I was an FDR-like figure, then Leo V was his Harry Truman. And I think that this legacy supersedes this whole obsession with Leo III and trying to imitate him at every turn. The second period of iconoclasm was not as intense as the first and never produced a zealous Constantine V figure. So this means that most of the time when people talk about the iconoclast controversy, they talk about Constantine V and the time of actual persecution. So Leo V's role in restoring iconoclasm was really not all that significant, and also most art historians think that most of the icons that were destroyed would have been destroyed in the first period rather than the second, so he probably didn't have an outsized impact on the poverty of our surviving art samples. I would have to say that when you think of that stereotype of what a Byzantine emperor is, no one meets that criteria better than Leo V. This guy was scheming, underhanded, amoral, but always interesting. And for that reason, like I said earlier, although he's definitely not one of the great emperors, he is still one of the most interesting. And I think that he's also a great example of someone who is too clever by half. His failed assassination attempt on Khan Krum backfired miserably, and apparently his elaborate James Bond villain-esque scheme to get rid of Michael the Amorian ended up being his downfall. Had he just merely had him executed normally, then there would be no figure for the conspirators to rally around, and he would have reigned longer, maybe even reigned long enough to send his son to the throne as Constantine VII. But of course he didn't, because he had to try to be too clever. So anyway, those are my thoughts on Leo V. Next time in this series, we'll look at Michael II the Amorian, or as he's better known, the guy who was not tied to an ape and thrown into a furnace. Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here, and today we're going to take a look at Thomas the Slav. I imagine quite a few of you are wondering right now, why have I made an entire video about Thomas the Slav if he was never technically an emperor? Well, there are a couple reasons. First, despite the fact that he never controlled Constantinople itself, Thomas did control a significant portion of the Byzantine world for a few years, and he was more or less, I would argue, a contender in a civil war which had no legitimate emperor rather than a usurper in the traditional sense, so I think that it's pretty fair to count him among the ranks of the emperors. The other reason why I included him is because if I had made just a video about Michael the Amorian, half or more of the video would have been just dealing with the civil war between Michael and Thomas, and it would seem kind of like I was trying to demean Michael since I would be making a video ostensibly about him, but spend half of my time talking about this other person. So I felt like this was the most fair and most narratively pleasing way to present this time period. So without any further ado, let's look at the career of Thomas the Slav, Byzantium's greatest rebel. So before we discuss the substance of Thomas's life, I think that it's worth observing that there are some major controversies surrounding him and his activities. So first of all, as I've already discussed a little bit, Thomas is not technically an emperor, but because he was so dominant for so long, I felt like it was worth including him. And I would also go even further and say that the war between Thomas and Michael was a war between two contenders engage in a civil war rather than being a clear act of usurpation against a legitimate emperor. Michael had the trappings of a legitimate emperor, but as we'll see a little bit in this video and then more when we talk about Michael, there were some problems. Another thing is that because when Thomas revolted, he gathered such a diverse cast of characters around him, people from all kinds of walks of life, all kinds of religious persuasions, ethnicities, etc. A lot of scholars have seen in this a great ideologically driven program, and they want to see Thomas more as a failed revolutionary than as a failed rebel / Civil War contender. However, I will argue that this is more of a peasant revolt, albeit a massive one, meaning that it played upon discontent but didn't have any clear solutions. Another thing that we need to be aware of is that the basic outline of events when it comes to Thomas's life in terms of where he was and when is also a subject of debate. A lot of that is because he wasn't a major figure prior to his revolt, but part of it too is that it seems pretty clear that Michael the Amorian engaged in quite a bit of smearing after Thomas was dead in order to further discredit him and rewrite history to where Michael was always this legitimate emperor and Thomas was nothing but a failed usurper. So we'll see that that has a lot to do with why, if you actually were to read all of the sources for this, you would see that Thomas supposedly spent the vast majority of his adult life in exile in the Abbasid Caliphate, although I'm pretty doubtful of some of those references, and we'll discuss that as we go along. Let's take a look at Thomas's early life. First of all, one important note is that in the sources, he tends to be called Thomas of Gazira, his hometown, rather than Thomas the Slav. Thomas the Slav is the label that modern scholars generally prefer to use for him. So if you read a book by a modern author, he will be referred to as Thomas the Slav. If you were to read one of the many chronicles which mention him, he would be referred to as Thomas of Gazira. So why is he called Thomas the Slav? Well, he was probably of South Slavic stock in a family that had been resettled in Asia Minor, or if we follow the account of Genesius, he was someone who was of Armenian descent rather than South Slavic descent. His hometown, as you might have guessed from his source name, is Gazira, and that is near the Pontus region. Thomas's parents were poor and he received no education, and in that respect he's actually quite a bit like Michael the Amorian. Michael was famously boorish and uneducated. And if we look at his age at the time of his revolt, he was between about 50 and 60. He was probably born around the year 670 or so CE. So when he did revolt or contend for the Civil War, however you want to look at it, he was basically making his last bid while he was still someone who was physically viable to fight a civil war. And he was someone who had amassed quite a bit of experience by that point in his life as well. One big benefit to now being in the 9th century and having survived the Byzantine Dark Ages is that the source material for the emperors becomes not only better and more informative, but also a great deal more colorful and animated. And few things illustrate that better than this little gem of a story right here. So, supposedly in 803, as he was preparing to embark on a bid for the throne against Nicephorus I, Bardanes Turcus gathered with 3 of his officers, Thomas the Slav, the future Leo V, and the future Michael II, and they visited a hermit at Philomelion, and they asked for a prophecy, and this hermit duly delivered. His prophecy was that Michael and Leo would both serve as emperors, Thomas would be acclaimed emperor, but die before he got to exercise power, while Bardanes Turcus's bid for the throne would fail. And then supposedly, despite having received this prophecy and then having seen so many parts of it play out, Thomas still ignored it and just went forward anyway and tried to become emperor. And it was because of this prophecy that Even though he came so close to becoming emperor, he didn't quite do it. Well, clearly it's not a real prophecy, but unlike a lot of prophecies which fail because they're wrong, this one is false because it was clearly made up well after the fact to make the story better. And that's a common trope in a lot of ancient and medieval literatures, that people will invent prophecies after the fact to try to make the story cooler, basically. Let's take a look at the course of Thomas's career prior to his bid for the imperial throne. Now, as I mentioned above, Thomas did not have an education and he did not come from a rich family. And because of that, he had no head start in life. If you'll recall way back to when I talked about, I believe it was Leo III, he was appointed to be the strategos of a theme when he was in his early to mid-20s. Nothing like that would have been in the cards for Thomas. It seems like his career started when he entered the service of a patrician in Constantinople, and then things didn't work out and Thomas had to do other things. One story says that his stint with this patrician ended because Thomas had the bad sense to sleep with his patron's wife, and then he had to flee to the Abbasid Caliphate to avoid the authorities. That, seems like a smear job, and it also really fails to answer the obvious question of how he was able to dodge the penalty for this later. How just leaving for a while and then coming back was a sufficient solution to the problem. Anyway, we do know also that he served under Bardanes Turcus. I believe there's someone who thinks that he was still in exile at the time and he did not serve under Bardanes, but he probably did. Bardanes Turcus, the guy mentioned in the prophecy above, he revolted and failed against Nicephorus I in 803. And it looks like, I would say definitely, that this is when Thomas fled to the Abbasids, and this actually was probably the first and only time. It's also possible, as some people think, that rather than fleeing to the Abbasids, he accepted a pardon, but because he had stuck with Bardanes longer than other officers like Leo and Michael, that his career was kind of held back and he was always viewed with sort of a jaundiced eye. Later on, when Leo V took power in 813, Thomas rose to prominence. It was possible that he was recalled from exile. It was also possible that he was there languishing in obscurity, but at any rate, he was not only restored to favor, but then granted high office. At the time of his declaration of civil war against Michael II, Thomas was actually the strategos of the Anatolican theme, so meaning he was one of the most important officials in the empire at that time. And because of Michael II winning and that old but true cliche that the victors write the histories, a lot of the stuff that we know about Thomas was probably smears from Michael's camp, which then got recorded and weren't sufficiently challenged and have been passed down, and we really, at this point, might not even be able to distinguish a smear from a fact from a rumor. So, anyway, but you already know that. You're watching a video on medieval history, you know that certain things have to be speculative. Let's examine the various sources of discontent that Thomas the Slav was able to tap into in order to fuel his revolt, revolution, civil war, whatever you want to call it. So first of all, Michael II had come to power under extremely unusual circumstances and didn't have the time to establish his legitimacy. If you'll recall, he was basically on death row, awaiting execution. Leo had gone to celebrate Christmas at the Hagia Sophia, and while he was at the altar, some men dressed as choir members had walked up to him, stabbed him, and killed him right on the altar in front of the public, and then declared Michael emperor. Michael had then been sworn in by the patriarch while still wearing some chains that they couldn't get undone because they couldn't find the key to those chains. So a lot of weird shit was involved in the death of Leo V and the rise of Michael II, and you can imagine that it would have raised more than a few eyebrows and made Michael look like a renegade and possibly even a bit of a clown. if you look at the eastern provinces, which provided the bulk of the manpower for Thomas's revolt, there were also some religious and political reasons that people there had for feeling alienated and being ready to revolt. On the one hand, Leo V had brought back iconoclasm, which by and large was more popular in the East than in the West. However, the thing is, this really wasn't the crux of the problem, apparently. It's very possible that scholars have simply overestimated the importance of the icon issue going into the 9th century. As we'll see, there's one group of people called the Paulicans, and they have their own reasons, apparently, and they back Thomas. Thomas, throughout the empire, posed as a champion of the poor, an enemy of corruption, and a tax cutter. And if you're a peasant and you're used to paying high taxes, or you're some rich landowner, either way, that's something that you could get behind. And it seems like a lot of the initial euphoria for Thomas was partly because people saw that they were going to save some money, and also maybe that if you combine that with Michael's seeming weakness and buffoonery, then you can see why Thomas would have had some immediate support. However, in terms of this whole narrative about maybe he was some sort of ideologically driven revolutionary, there's a problem immediately. So, if he was appealing to people in the East on religious grounds, part of that would have been saying that he was iconoclastic. In the West, though, icons were super popular, and when he would send messages to potential supporters in the Balkans, he would say that not only was he a defender of icons, but that he was going to punish iconoclasts. So, basically, Thomas the Slav was a politician, and he was everyone's friend, everything to everyone. And in terms of why I believe that this is more of a civil war than a usurpation in the traditional sense, Thomas revolted immediately upon hearing of Leo's murder. It took a few days for the news to travel. So he thought of himself as being the most legitimate successor since he had been good friends with Leo. And although Michael at one time had been good friends with Leo, as I mentioned, Leo was on the verge of executing him. So you can kind of see from Thomas's perspective how he probably very much legitimately thought that he was the obvious and most logical choice to succeed his good friend Leo. While Thomas espoused many messages, so it would seem, I can't help but feel like ultimately, at his heart, he was a rebel without a real cause, much like a modern politician a la Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. He was running more or less because he wanted to be emperor and he saw an opportunity. He was in a good position. He was the governor of the Anatolic theme in 820, so he was well placed and had a starting army. He could also claim to be avenging Leo V. They were legitimately friends and political allies. It also seems that there was a personal animus between Thomas the Slav and Michael II, and maybe Thomas felt like his position would be totally lost if he simply allowed Michael to become emperor. He maybe felt like he would either be exiled again or removed from office in some other way. It also appears that despite the fact that Thomas had a diverse cast of characters around him, including pretty much every known ethnic group in the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire, it probably really wasn't an anti-Greek coalition as such. Now, some scholars have interpreted it that way, but I think that maybe they're focusing a little too much on that aspect and not focusing on how Michael was able to put down the revolt relatively easily once Thomas was dead. If it had truly been an anti-Greek coalition, then that would have been a great deal more difficult, and presumably this newly awakened ethnic coalition would have found a new candidate. But anyway, another thing is that there is a tradition that is worth mentioning briefly, that Thomas was in rebellion before Leo's death, but most scholars have pointed to this as almost certainly propaganda from Michael. So basically the story is that Thomas had actually revolted against Leo V, and then Michael had inherited that revolt. But actually, it looks more likely that Thomas revolted against Michael once Michael had slain Leo. And just to recapitulate my point, I don't think that there was any real underlying cause for Thomas's revolt other than that he wanted to be emperor and he didn't want that bastard Leo II, the Amorian, to be the emperor. One group of people who strongly supported Thomas are worth singling out and talking about in greater detail, and that group are the Paulicians. The Paulicians are a relatively poorly understood Christian sect who became very prominent during this period. Now, they were named after the 3rd century bishop of Antioch, Paul of Samosata, so at first I assumed that they were named after the Apostle Paul, but it's actually a 3rd century bishop and theologian. As far as what their theology actually is, I don't really care, and also I don't think it's well known anyway. Most of what we know about them is from hostile sources. Supposedly they were dualist, meaning that they believe in two gods. But if they called themselves Christians, that seems a little unlikely. At any rate, this group was politically prominent during the 8th and early 9th centuries in the Byzantine eastern provinces, and they would become active especially in trying to determine imperial politics from the time of Thomas until a couple decades later. They had first risen to the attention of the imperial authorities under Leo V, and he had actually persecuted them. And that adds another little wrinkle into this whole idea of there being like a unified ideology behind Thomas's followers. Because remember, Thomas is campaigning as the legitimate successor to Leo V and the avenger of Leo V. Yet, one of his biggest and most adamant support groups is a group of people who were persecuted by that same Leo V. So again, there's a lot of complexity here, and the sources clearly got some things mixed up in some way. At any rate, we do know that the Paulician creed was very prominent among Armenians especially, and also people living in the Eastern themes more broadly, but people of Armenian descent especially. Let's discuss yet another wrinkle in this story, and something else that's really hard to wrap our heads around. So, there's yet another story about how Thomas tried to gain support from people, and that story is that he claimed to be Constantine VI. If you'll recall, Constantine VI was a young and not very successful emperor who was blinded by his mother Irene, and then seems to have died within a few years. However, it appears that people speculated that Constantine had escaped and was living in exile quietly somewhere, and maybe he was even some sort of folk hero in the eastern provinces. At any rate, supposedly Thomas told people that he was actually Constantine VI and that he was returning to reclaim his throne. It's not really clear how many people would have believed this, or how much sway the name of Constantine VI would have had a generation later. Some scholars actually have posited that this act of impersonation occurred around the year 800 when the memory of Constantine VI was still prominent, and that after trying to impersonate an emperor, he was then readmitted to imperial service. Just because of that detail alone, I'm going to go ahead and say that there is basically a 0% chance of that interpretation being correct. But at any rate, he may have had this as one of his sources of appeal, or maybe this was yet another smear by Michael to try to show that Thomas was some sort of carnival barker or charlatan. And because this revolt or revolution or civil war wasn't complicated enough already, let's go ahead and throw yet another layer of complexity into the equation. Thomas was largely funded by the Abbasid Caliphate, and they strongly supported his effort. So, he was coronated by the Bishop of Antioch. Remember, Michael II, being in Constantinople, had been crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople, and that was the traditional way for an emperor to be legitimate. Well, obviously Thomas didn't have access to the Patriarch of Constantinople, so he had to go with what he had on hand, and the only way to get to the Bishop of Antioch was to work with the Caliphate, since Antioch was under caliphal authority, so he had to have the cooperation of the Abbasid magistrates. It also seems that the Caliphate really bankrolled Thomas's revolt, and one of Thomas's sort of planks was that he was going to lower taxes and not tax his subjects to death. And in the areas where he controlled, it does seem like maybe he eased off taxes a bit. And if so, this would have been possibly enabled by the large sum of foreign money that he had. So he didn't need to raise as much money from his own supporters and subjects because he was getting paid by the caliph. Possibly. Hard to say. And it's also hard to say what quantity of money we're talking about. If this was exaggerated by Michael, again, like, you know, this is another area where certainty is impossible. However, I would also point out that just the idea of caliphal collusion in itself does not necessarily prove that Thomas had a long-term relationship with the Abbasids, or that he had spent years there cultivating a relationship and planning this revolt meticulously. If you think about it from the perspective of the Abbasids, having the Byzantines engaged in a civil war would give them opportunities to capitalize and possibly gain some land later. The more the Byzantines fight each other, the less they can reclaim Abbasid lands, and the more that the Abbasids can possibly then resume the offensive and take more land from the Byzantines. So even if they didn't really care about Thomas one way or the other, or didn't know him from Adam, you know, they could still possibly support someone like a Thomas. In the spring of 821, Thomas invaded the empire, and either initially or over time managed to amass about 80,000 men. Most of the themes of Asia Minor simply defected and joined Thomas's cause. The two exceptions were the themes of Opsikion and the Armeniacan, and presumably these two themes were either loyal to Michael personally, or else they had some other reservation about Thomas, and by themes, of course, I mean the strategoi in charge of them respectively. Thomas had a larger force than either of these two strategoi, and he managed to win some battles against the imperial forces, but he never conquered either of the loyal themes completely and had to leave them unoccupied in his rear. At one point in one of these battles, his adoptive son Constantius was killed in action, and without Constantius, Thomas was down his heir, and he would have to find another one later. However, his friendly fleets managed to take control of the Aegean, and he had enough naval dominance that he was able to cross over into Europe and lay siege to Constantinople beginning in December of 821. So it hadn't been ideal. He had lost his adoptive son, and he hadn't fully conquered the two themes that were resisting him, but he was clearly winning, and things had gone a lot better for him than they had for Michael. And, of course, he was now besieging the capital, and, prospects were still looking pretty good overall. If we look at the situation in December 821, Thomas clearly had the upper hand. He had the resources of Asia Minor behind him, and if you'll remember, the reconquest of the Balkans had only really started under Nicephorus I, and this had been a process that had only been happening for a couple of decades. So without question, the bulk of Byzantium's power was in the eastern provinces, and Thomas controlled almost all of them. He also, at this point, would have had the majority of the army. When those themes had defected to him, they brought along a lot of men. He also had the majority of the fleet. The only fleets that we know that Michael had were the ones in Constantinople and probably the one in Greece. So, Thomas looked like he was on the verge of not only winning, but winning in the near future. And he decided to attack the city immediately. And only the combination of recent renovations on the city's seawalls that Leo V had performed and some strong contrary winds drove off Thomas's ships during the winter. Well, Thomas didn't take that too seriously. He just thought, well, okay, so it's hard to launch naval campaigns during the winter. That's always been a thing, and in the Age of Sail, that would remain a problem up until, the end of the Age of Sail. So Thomas decided to bide his time, wait for spring, and then he would sweep into Constantinople, become the emperor, and everything would be awesome. Around this time, probably before spring arrived, Thomas decided to choose a new co-emperor, and he took up a monk who took the name of Anastasius. We don't really know anything else about him other than that he became Thomas's co-emperor, and that, of course, he was later executed for accepting that post. When the spring of 822 arrived, Thomas was still feeling pretty confident, and Michael II demonstrated a little bit more of the wile that he had demonstrated when he took power in the first place. What he did was he put it out that the city was on the verge of collapse, his men were demoralized, and when Thomas heard this, he decided that the moment was right for a strike. So he decided to launch a land and sea attack on the city at once to capitalize on Michael being demoralized. However, Michael's men were doing just fine. And when Thomas's land forces got near, Michael's men sallied out from the walls and won a victory. And then when Thomas's ships got close, Michael's ships were able to sail out and defeat them. Well, that's a pretty good victory for Michael, but Thomas is still laying siege, and he gets a second fleet when his Aegean fleet arrives. So the balance of power is restored to what it had been, and Michael's victory seems to have been undone a bit. But then that second fleet tried to attack, and Michael was able to employ his Greek fire. It's probable that both sides during the Civil War had Greek fire, but maybe either Michael's men were able to use it more effectively for whatever reason, or I don't know exactly why they were the only ones who were able to use it, but I think that it's pretty likely that Thomas's naval forces would have also had some access to it. At any rate, though, Michael won again, and without that naval force blockading Constantinople, there was really no siege. Yet Thomas really didn't know what to do at this point, and it more or less devolved into a stalemate that Thomas couldn't figure out how to break. Interestingly enough, the factor that ultimately broke the stalemate between Michael and Thomas was something that neither of them desired, and that was the intervention of the Bulgar Khan Omertag. So, Omertag had offered his help to Michael as soon as Thomas had laid siege to Constantinople, but Michael had declined, supposedly because he didn't wish to see pagans shed Christian blood on behalf of other Christians. Most likely he really didn't care as long as he won the Civil War, but that's neither here nor there. Omertag, however, despite being rejected by Michael, decided to come anyway, in the name of friendship with Michael. But his real motive was because he knew that this would give him a great excuse to collect plunder from Byzantine territory, and do so in a way which wouldn't necessarily lead to war with the Byzantines, so win-win. Omertag had no intention of fighting Thomas initially, and he was just laying waste to areas not all that close to where Thomas was. Thomas, however, who wanted to be the legitimate emperor, decided to take his army deeper into Thrace, and he met the Bulgars on the plain of Caductus in March of 823, near the city of Heraclea, and he fought a battle. And unfortunately for Thomas, he lost big time, and his army, while not completely destroyed, got beaten pretty soundly. And after this point, Thomas's cause really starts to unravel. People lose confidence, and he knew that he was down to one last hope, and that would be getting Michael to come out to fight him, winning a pitched battle, and then seizing Constantinople. So, how does he go about that? Thomas, looking for that one last miracle battle, took his forces to a position about 20 miles west of Constantinople in an open flat plain called the Plain of Diabasis, and he knew that because his forces had recently been beaten and they were greatly reduced in number, that Michael would be tempted to come out and fight because he had the numbers, and because defeating Thomas in the field would decisively win this war and restore a lot of his prestige. So there was quite a bit in it for Michael, and he duly obliged Thomas. Now, Thomas's idea was that he would retreat in the face of Michael's attack, let Michael's men get strung out in a pursuit, and then have his men wheel around and counterattack. However, when he ordered his men to wheel around and counterattack, his men surrendered instead because they were demoralized and they no longer really believed in Thomas. Thomas and his key followers then fled to the nearby city of Arcadiopolis. They expelled all the women and children, and they remained under siege for the majority of 823. So all summer they were under siege, and then in October their foodstuffs ran out and they surrendered. So Thomas was then executed on the spot by Michael. Michael took his imperial purple boots, put them over Thomas's throat to show dominance, had Thomas's hands and feet cut off, had his body impaled on a stake right in front of Arcadiopolis. Later on, he had the same thing done to Thomas's co-emperor Anastasius. And, not the best way to go, but if you are the person inflicting that punishment, it's obviously pretty stylish. Most Byzantine usurpers are nothing more than obscure names with failed armies behind them. However, Thomas the Slav actually does have a discernible legacy. First of all, the majority of his supporters surrendered and received pardon by early 824, and then they went on to serve under Michael II and future emperors. And in that capacity, they helped to keep the empire afloat and helped it to deal with renewed Islamic aggression. This civil war between Michael and Thomas weakened the Byzantine Empire and dominated an entire third or more of Michael II's reign. In fact, Michael II's reign makes no sense without Thomas the Slav and his revolt. Thomas most likely didn't weaken the empire as much as some people say, but his naval activity certainly did, and that really compounded the long-term neglect of the fleet that had taken place ever since the last Arab attempts to seize Constantinople. And we'll talk about all of that when we get to Michael II, the Amorian, and talk about his reign after Thomas the Slav. This revolt really demonstrated some of the very real divides in Byzantine society, and it gives us some insight into sort of, latent conflicts which normally did not flare up into actual violence. Obviously, these conflicts did not prove fatal for the empire, and they didn't lead to its dissolution in the 9th century, but it does give us a lot of information to play with when it comes to trying to really figure out the social dynamics of the empire and the various groups within it, how they identified themselves, all that kind of stuff. And I would say if Thomas had to have one legacy above all others, it was simply that the complexity of his revolt, the way he was smeared in the sources, and everything else that we've talked about has really spawned all kinds of scholarly speculation, and he has been and will remain a fascinating figure in Byzantine history, presumably as long as people choose to study Byzantine history.